I would say the key word was help, and I think Marianne is another guilty party here when it comes to help Ottumwa and Iowa develop the relationship with the new Iowans that we've had, which in turn have helped the economy and really I think the society in general with new culture and new foods and other things. So I take credit for just a bit of it, not the whole thing, and not even a significant portion, but thank you for those kind of words. So the focus that I have today is on economic development. And really one of the things I'm going to try to do is explain from the 30,000 feet, how did we get in Iowa such a big diversity in such a short time when it comes to the Latino population. Why are they coming to Iowa? And the other piece that I'm really wanting to focus on is what's the future, what are the trends that we're seeing, and where's the potential as a state to capitalize on this talent and influence that we're getting. So, before I do that, I feel compelled to talk a little bit about extension. I don't have it wrong. Sorry about that. So just a brief introduction about extension. We are, if you look at the history of extension, it was created by President Lincoln, and one of the ideas that we had at that time was, as a nation, was that the college was very restricted for people. You had to go to a big city or a town where a college was based, and it was very prohibitive as well. So it was very hard to spread knowledge in our country, and so there came the notion that we needed local presence for higher education. And so at that time, we didn't have community colleges and so on. And so the Morel Act, what it did was spread knowledge, and it chose a university in every state, and it would be called the land-grant university. And their mission was to spread knowledge from research and evidence-based. So that's the reason why we do have an office in every single county in the state. And if you're not familiar with the extension councils, those are locally elected officials, and they make decisions local-wise on what program the community needs to succeed. So when you hear extension, then think of locally. And we do have a lot of programs that we're well known for 4-H, which is a wonderful program, but we do have other programs as well. 3 more units. We do have CIRRUS, which works with industrial research. We do have families under 4-H as well. We do have community economic development, which I'm going to talk about. And we also have agriculture and natural resources. But the least known and one of the units at this time is economic development. And one of the things that we do is also community development. So we help communities do planning, we do engage community, we have leadership curriculum that we do as well. And all is based in economic and community development. So if you haven't visited the website, I invite you to do that, because it's really, there's a big menu of things that we can do for your community. But that's my speech for extension, and I'll stop there and go for the topic that we're talking about. And so how did we get to Iowa, have a large influx of Latinos? And if you look at the history of Iowa, I could say firmly that Latinos are not new to Iowa. If you look at the historical records in agriculture, you will find that we had Latinos working here before then. But it wasn't a connection that was happening with communities. So what we had was migrant workers that were going to the fields, they were staying in the fields, they lived in the fields, and so at the end of the season, they would go back to their state or the country that they were coming from. So we had a lot of traffic back and forth from Texas and also from Mexico. That people were coming for the season and they would go back. So they didn't have an impact in our culture in our state for a long time. But what has changed is all of a sudden we have a decline in population, especially in rural areas. We did also have an economic downturn in the 80s and early 90s. And so we had especially a loss of population. And the most significant was the youth, the younger population. Okay? So somehow at that time we did not have the appeal for young people to stay or come back to Iowa after college. So we were definitely facing some issues in regard to population. So at the same time, we were having the meat plants and other agricultural companies that were in sectors that were bouncing back, and all of a sudden they needed a new labor. And that's when we see the Latinos coming, and not only the Latinos, but mainly the Latinos coming at those years. Now, it probably would not be correct if I say that they were only coming for jobs. Now, that's a big piece of it, but I'll show you another factor that influenced that. So before we had the migrants that came to work for the season, and they would get a paycheck and then leave after that and take that money and spend it somewhere else, which if you think of economics, is not a very wise thing for us to give people money and then say, well, go spend it in another state. We want to capitalize on that. So the reality that we had in the late 90s was that the migrants were coming to Iowa, but they were staying in Iowa. Okay? And we'll look at some other reasons why. But if you remember 1993, what we had there happened in, I don't know if I remember it, was NAFTA. And there was a big debate whether that was right or wrong and so on, and I won't go into that. But one effect that we had with NAFTA was that it opened up the barriers for us to sell products to Mexico, and vice versa as well. So you saw a negative impact in our industries, as per se, our jobs in Iowa, in the sense that we did lose some manufacturers. They moved production to Mexico, which was expected. But we wouldn't have signed this agreement if we knew it was going to be a loss for us. And so we knew we had something to gain from this agreement, or our government did, and that was we had a lot of corn. And Mexico, obviously, if you look at their diet, is a corn-based diet. And the other thing was, it was a corn-producing country as well. So south of us, we have a potential customer, but we also have a competitor when it came to agriculture. So what happened with NAFTA is opened the boundaries, and so we were able to sell corn and other agricultural products to Mexico at a much lower price than what they can produce. So if you can imagine the size of a farm in Iowa this big and the size of a farm in Mexico this big, which one do you think is going to be able to produce corn cheaper? And so what happened is that we put a lot of the Mexican agricultural workforce out of work. And that's the same time when we start seeing an influx of Latino coming from rural areas. If you look at the Latino population in Iowa today, they don't come from Mexico City, they don't come from Guatemala City. When you ask them where they're from, a large majority of them will say from very rural, small communities. Okay? So there's a connection. Iowa to them was a very rural state. We also did a survey a few years ago and asked if Iowa was the first place they came to the United States, and the answer was no, as you can imagine. Most of them had landed in big cities, most of them in Houston, LA, and other big cities in the Southwest. And what do you think was the impression of these folks moving from a village of 300 people to a city of at least 3 million people, probably more? It wasn't a good fit. Okay, so you ask these folks, did you know where you come from? And they say, I lived in LA, and they could not acculturate to that society, and so they kept looking for another place to go that reflected a little bit more home. Okay, and so that's at the same time when we can start seeing the migration coming to Iowa, especially rural places. Okay, so we have the migration to the United States, but eventually they end up here. And the way that it happened was mostly the male who come. Usually the male had been in the United States for a long time or going back and forth, and so most of them, for what I've seen, applied for some type of immigration status during the immigration amnesty that we had in 86, 89 with President Reagan, and so they had paperwork, but the rest of the family, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases were lacking those documents. So we had the male come up to Iowa, check out communities, see if there was work, check out the cost of living, if the communities were safe, and so on. And then if they chose a community and where they feel good, they will call the family and try to bring them. And so that's kind of what we're seeing now with people from Africa. That's a big trend that we're seeing in Iowa now. It's immigration from Africa, refugees, most of them from Ethiopia and Eritrea, and that's the same kind of mode where the male is coming, checking out the community, and then they're applying for paperwork for the rest of their family. So kind of the same, which makes sense. So all of a sudden we have Iowa face large rural immigration. So that's kind of the census information I wanted to give you, but I wanted to give you a little bit bigger picture than just Iowa is growing in Latino numbers or Iowa is growing in immigration numbers. I wanted to give you a little bit of a historic perspective of they just didn't happen to get in the car and choose Iowa. We had a political ramifications of a decision where they were intended or not. So when it comes to leadership, one of the things that we face in Iowa as a challenge is how do we get newcomers to get involved in our communities? And that's something that we've struggled as communities and as organizations to get people to serve on boards, to serve as volunteers, to represent their own cultural groups. And one of the reasons, doing some research, is that in the United States, we basically operate under a formal system of leadership. We belong to organizations that we associate with, such as chambers. You might belong to Main Street, service clubs like Rotary or Lions or Kiwanis and other groups. And so we do get our information from those sources. When you look at communities that are coming, or groups that are coming from other countries, these systems don't exist. Okay. So when we say, well, why don't Latino business belong to chambers? Well, they're not familiar with the notion of a chamber. And even in many countries, you do not trust government. You get victimized by government. And so it's something that you stay away from. And I don't know if Marianne, you were one of the trips that we went to Mexico, but we had in Iowa a bus full of people from Iowa, and we got stopped by the state patrol, and we had to fork out some money. So when you have those experiences, yeah, quite a bit of money. So when you have those experiences in those countries, it makes sense that you do not want to work with any formal members because they probably represent corruption. You've been victimized by those systems before. So how do they operate? Well, in informal ways, which makes total sense. They rely on families, a place of origin, friends, former co-workers. So when I go into a Latino business, and again, not only Latino, but mostly of them Latino, and I ask, how did you start? Where did you go to get money? The answer is not going to be here or the banks, but it's going to be here. Right? I worked for so many years and I was saving it and I opened and I got mom to chip in some money and so on. So it was very interesting during the tough years we had after 2008 because some of them were able to survive better than other businesses because they had relied on informal sources of money. So one gentleman told me, I haven't paid my mom the last 2 months, but she's okay, she's forgiving me. I said, you don't want to be in bad terms with your mom. But he was able to write it a little bit better than if maybe he would have owned that money to the bank. So there's a little bit of relation there of how these immigrants were able to survive the downturn in economics. So it's very hard in Iowa and the United States to change this way of thinking, which is not wrong. Right? And maybe try to connect them to these sources. And likewise, these organizations have a lot of trouble with the new Iowans trying to get to join the same way. And so there has to be a central point where we meet. And so that's some of the things that I have been doing and other folks have been doing in Iowa is try to connect, the word connector, trying to connect those two groups and not represent one or the other, but trying to get to join in common ground. So, but when you're looking for volunteers, when you're looking for organizations to join your organization or your community, where would you go? Well, you probably need to look for the leadership of this organization. So if I am the chamber in Waterloo and I want to involve somebody in the community from the Upper Miss community, what I need to do is look for who they think their leader is and try to get that leader to make that connection for me. And it's a trust-based relationship. I cannot just walk in the first day to the Latino grocery store and say, hey, here's the pamphlet from the chamber, come and join us. Okay, that doesn't work. What works is you go in there, you get to know the owner, you get to know them by first name, you get to know the family, and then when you establish that trust and they see that you're not there to make advantage of them or gain anything specific, and then they'll join. Or if you walk in there with the priest that they know, or with another business owner, or somebody that they trust, then you can talk about trust transfer in some ways. Okay. So, sorry for the bad picture. I took this picture as I was driving in Canary, Iowa, which is not too far from here. This is a community I've seen a lot of immigrant groups come in. And I think this picture represents the failure as a community and also the success. I'll show you the success, so it's not all bad. But at that point, a realization that, oh, you know, it's just a group of people, they don't have any economic power, they probably don't have any education, which, you know, if you look at the historical trends of immigrants in United States, that first generation is very low in education, so there's some truth to that. But what we cannot do is undermine their capacity of growth, and they're very entrepreneurial. If you look at research, immigrant groups, and we've seen it, you know, with the Italian, we saw it with the Irish, they're very entrepreneurial. They're used to taking risks. I mean, they left their country, for goodness sake, moved to a strange country that speaks a whole different language, and so they are used to it. So what can happen if we have an entrepreneur or a section of the community and we engage them? And this is the result. This is in Perry as well. So this is the restaurant that these folks were able to open. So if you go to Perry, I recommend that you stop there. Amazing family, but they had never, when I stopped and asked them in this picture, said, you know, has anybody from the city or the chamber or economic development stopped and seen you? The answer was no. And so we have a wonderful answer to our downtowns, because research also shows that immigrant groups love downtowns, Main Street. Okay? They're very social, high social communities and cultures, and so they're not looking to be by themselves in the middle of nowhere, maybe in a mall or in a strip mall. They're looking at places where people can walk to, where there's maybe another business next door that can be complementary, maybe a taco place or so on, or a grocery store. And so this transition makes a lot of sense. Okay? So now when I look at this picture, another common mistake might be to say, okay, they're open the restaurant, they're happy, now we can leave them alone. And the answer is we're still missing the big picture if we stop there. If you look at some of the most successful entrepreneurs that are new Iowans or newcomers to this country, is they never stop. You know, I'm sure that all of you know an entrepreneur, and they're always thinking of what's next. Right? And so we do need to think of that picture and say, what do you want to do next? As I was mentioning in Passport to Prosperity, we had a gentleman at Ottumwa who, you know, started with the little store, and then now he owns 4 different businesses. It's just an amazing transition of growth. And so, again, we cannot be stuck in communities and saying, well, this is good enough. Okay? So, and I want to think of Des Moines as an example. We think of rural areas, but think of Des Moines. Where's the Latino business district in Des Moines? Not very far from here. They are right around here, right? If I'm positioned right. So they can't be any closer because of the price, right, of land. So they do look at that as part of the business model, which you should. But this area, if you remember, a few years ago was a very area depressed economically. And so they rebuilt that whole area. They're investing a lot of money. And again, they could be on this side of the capital because of price and the business model that they're looking at, but they're as close as you can get on the other side, which is very interesting. So that economic impact is happening all over Iowa, not only in rural communities. What's happening in rural communities is that the newcomers have taken a bigger chunk of our population, okay, because we're smaller. And so, and again, they're looking for rural communities. So it's natural that if you look to Denison, Iowa, and you look at their, they represent 26% of the community, Latinos, which is over the national average. And you look in Des Moines, for example, where it's huge population, but it's in terms of percentage is obviously much smaller. So, but if you look at the numbers in the census of the largest concentration of Latinos in Iowa, if you look at numbers, the answer is going to be Polk County. If you look at percentages, all the sudden the map lights up with all the rural communities such as Marshall County, obviously Denison, Ottumwa, Perry, and so on, Columbus Junction, and so on. Right? So I want to look at this picture because it represents something that we've been hearing a lot about, and this is the concentration of Latinos in this country. Now, it's not all immigration, that's where I'm going with this point. If you look at it, and this is from the US Census. Okay, explain this to me. Why is there such a large concentration of Latinos in California and the Southwest?
Because it used part of Mexico?
Yeah, and so we have cultural, historic reasons. This was part of Spain, and then it became part of Mexico, and then eventually the border, as you hear the term, the border crossed them. They didn't cross the border. And so, obviously, you have the same thing happening in Texas and Florida, which was also part of Spain. So those are historical, natural areas for Latinos. And until the 90s, this was it. This was all you had. And so what we have now, again, remember that NAFTA agreement, what we have is growth also in places where this population was not happening. This is one of the areas of fastest growing. Look at that area over here, okay? And obviously, Illinois and that central northern region, okay? Being next door to it, we cannot expect to be immune from this growth, right? And it was just a matter of time before we were affected in good terms from it. So, right now, if you look at Illinois, ranks 5th in the country in numbers of Latino. So not percentage of the population, okay? We have higher states with percentage, but number-wise, total of population, okay? So we are next door to the 5th largest Latino state in the nation. And when we think of that, we always tend to think, well, these states have higher, and all of a sudden, no, they're right next door. So that means a whole opportunities for us and something to think about, right? So what is the future? Obviously, and I'll tell you a story, something that happened to me in Ottumwa when I met another Latino for the first time, and that hopefully represents what the future is about. When I was in Ottumwa, again, I think there was only 3 Latinos in we were counting them the other day, and there were 3 Latinos in the whole community. I was the only one in high school, and so I went to the community college after that, and one day I was working at the library while I was going to college, and so this guy sits in front of me. He needed a student ID, so I took his picture, I said, what's your name? And he gives me a name in Latino name, okay? And so I got all excited and said, hola, and the guy said, hello. Right there and there, I should have known a little bit better, but I wasn't. I was young and I was stupid, and so therefore I kept saying, you don't speak Spanish? And he said, no, I don't speak Spanish. And I said, oh, I'm sorry with the name, and he's like, well, and I said, so where are you from? And he said, I'm from Texas. I'm like, oh, okay, sorry. I said, so where are your parents from? And the guy said, well, they're from Texas. Okay, so I said, where are your grandparents from? And the answer was, they're from Texas. Okay? So the guy luckily had his sense of me, he said, stop, I know where you're going. We're not from Mexico. And that was such an eye-opening experience for me because I was assuming, and this is from another Latino, right, that he had to be from Mexico somewhere. He could not be Latino and be an American, right? And so when you go through other states, I've had a chance of traveling to those areas, and you see that immigration is a big, important factor for the Latino community. But it's not it. It's not the whole picture. And so when we think in Iowa, when we equate in Iowa and in the Midwest, that Latino must be an immigrant, it might be okay, it was okay probably in the 1990s, okay, even though this happened in 1990, so I still, but it becomes less true as we move on. If you look at, for example, my community of Ottumwa, where we have 22% of the school district is Latino today, most of those kids were not born in Mexico or outside of our nation, but they were born here. And so we're starting to run into different issues which we had not expected, which was the loss of Spanish as one of their, and so we're losing the bilingual battle at this point in Ottumwa because we do not have a bilingual school district, which Marian knows is one of my big battles. So, but the point is that we keep equating Latinos to immigrants. And so we ran into trouble with that because as we move on, the generations are going to be less attached to immigration than we think they are. And so we need to be careful with those games because it can get us into backward thinking. So we do have new Americans who obviously immigration is important to them. Their parents might be first wave of immigrants or their grandparents and so on. Some of you might still be able to relate to the immigration story because of your ancestry. So, but the truth is that you're less and less, as we move down to our children and grandchildren, we're less connected to that first generation. And I'd like to ask the audience, how many of you speak German? Probably not very much, right? And so, but how many of you can trace your ancestry to German or Norwegians or Swedes and so on? Probably a big group, right? And so we need to stop thinking when it comes to economic development and community development of immigration as the big picture. It is still part of the puzzle, but it's not the big thing. And so we need to engage them thinking of the potential that they bring. They also bring issues. When we have a large group of people moving to community, we cannot expect that nothing is going to happen, that everything is going to go flawless. Because we're human beings, and so we are scared of the unknown, right? And so when people say, well, this should not happen in Ottumwa, the answer is, no, I think it was part of the process. Now, we addressed it as a community, I think, really well, in the sense that we did training on both sides, talk about, these are the people that are coming, they're not coming to do this or that, they're coming to this or this, and so, but we also did cultural trainings on the other side. Okay, so you're new to the country, how do you get a driving permit? How do you get to open a business? What are your rights? What are your obligations as well? And so that's where Iowa State Extension has focused its energy when it's come to working with communities and newcomers is let's empower that group and let's empower the community and let's get inclusive and see what they can gain from each other. So I want to stop here because I want to have a conversation with you, and I'm an enemy of large, long PowerPoints. I suffer through those myself, so I'm hoping that this will be a discussion. If you have not had a chance to sit down through a diversity training and the demographics, the change of Iowa, it's very interesting, and that's a whole different presentation that I could have done for hours. But I want to answer questions, talk about maybe some myths that you hear, or maybe some of the trends that we see for the future. So I'll open the floor for that. And don't be shy, I'll start talking again. Yes.
When we are looking at generation after generation of Latinos living in Ottumwa or Marshalltown, can you talk a little bit about what is happening with the generation that is the oldest, 60 and older, and what's less likely to have learned English, more likely to be isolated? What are your projections, and what are some of the challenges?
Sure, that's a very good question because we're just now starting to see that first wave of Latino immigrants that came in the 90s and are hitting retirement. So not all of them. If you look at the demographics, the vast majority that came were still young, small kids. So that was definitely a big boost for our schools and so on. But there was a group that's coming that is now retiring. And we're facing a lot of issues with them because of retirement. They came and they were working in the fields in the 80s and 70s and so on. In a lot of cases, they were not contributing to their own Social Security, and so, or had retirement plans, and so that's definitely a big issue. The people that I've been dealing with, they want to stay in Iowa. which is interesting in that. But now all their families here, so it makes sense. But economically, we're having some trends where they're going back to their countries because it's obviously cheaper to live there. So some of them are getting Social Security, but it's very small compared to what we had expected maybe from a person that was born here and has been contributing their whole life, or maybe even save some money on the side for that. So that's one of the issues that I'm seeing. And of course, then we can have disabilities or they need care and so on. There's obviously the language barrier. Many of them are wanting to become citizens. Some of them apply, they can because of the time that they've been here, they can do it in their own language, and because of literacy, they can do smaller tests. But there's some that came that because maybe they came in the late 90s, they still don't qualify for the time that they have been here. So they qualify for citizenship, but not for doing it in their language. And so if you're a permanent resident, you cannot retire to Mexico because you have to live here. And so, but if you haven't made enough money to have a decent retirement, that's when we see the issues. The folks that are citizens and they can move back and they still get their checks. But like I said, I'm seeing a lot of trends where they want to stay here. And so that's obviously interesting when you look at the general population.
What are, I suppose, some trends for immigrants who are eligible for regular employment? Where are those people who are not entrepreneurs necessarily? Where are they going to look for jobs? Are they also relying on their social network, or are they going to Iowa Workforce Development? Are they going to area businesses to try to find those jobs? I work at Des Moines Waterworks, and we have a very high number of Caucasian employees, with a very, very low percentage of minorities. So I'm curious what that trend would be, how to communicate with that community.
Sure. When it comes to employment, it's very interesting because, and this is kind of expected with any first group of immigrant, because of their low educational background, it's very hard for them to move on unless they enroll to school, college and so on. But the average education level of the new first wave of Latinos that we're against is third grade. Many of them below that, literacy problems. So when we're talking about English learning, that first generation is very tough to work with. Not because they don't want to learn English, but because of the literacy problems that they bring from home. And so, you want them to learn English, but they don't even know how to write Spanish. And so it's very hard, and I almost sometimes say that, we have to work with that first generation, but we also have to have an understanding that we're not going to get all those folks to community college or, their masters and so on. We have some. But in Iowa, and really in any other states that they face a new wave of immigration, they almost have to wait until the second generation or third generation to start looking at professionals. In Iowa, we still have a deficit of bilingual employees, and so we have to bring them from other places. I had Ottumwa, I had a large employer who was, now their number one market is South America. And they needed a bilingual employee that was a professional, experienced in marketing. And I had to look outside of Ottumwa because even though we have now 22% of our kids are Latino, they're not there yet. And we're still seeing graduation rates high, but they haven't finished their college yet. And so I had to go look somewhere else. Using that social network, I knew there was a bilingual person in our community, and so we made that possible. But for employees, it's still, bilingual employees are still a hot commodity. You have to look at paying more than the other employees if you're looking at recruiting-wise. It will get better with the future, but now, of course, we're seeing the kids who are not learning the Spanish. And so, but they're still Latino, and so if you want a diverse workforce, but if you need bilingual workforce, that's always going to be tough because those kids, the second generation, are not interested most of them, in the bilingual education in our schools, except few. are not supporting that bilingual thinking. And so we tend to lose it. So hopefully that answer a little bit is that it'll take a little bit to get there.
Well, I think part of your question was, our biggest employer in Ottumwa is Cargill Meat Processing. And all of their hires go through, whether they're Latinos or, you know, they're sitting right there in Monroe County to begin with, they go through Iowa Works. And that's true of most all of the big employers, I think, the hospital and others. And then we also have all the banking institutions at this point have one or more bilingual people. School district does too. I don't know about John here as much.
And one of the big things that we see with employers is hire at the lowest job and help promote those folks. The banks, we have a bank in Ottumwa where there's a lady that was bilingual that started as a teller and now she's the branch director. I mean, you're not going to have that with the whole group, but you will be able to see some folks who are interested in pursuing education, and they will. You'll see that with the schools and with Cargill. They promote that where some of the supervisors started at the line. So,
I've been here for 3 years, and I find it fascinating that in this country, class is something people don't talk about. Like they just don't talk about it, and I think for the immigration topic, that's really important. You were mentioning that people don't have like chambers, Main Street, church clubs, but I think in Latin America they do have, but they don't need to migrate. So the people who are migrating don't have those connections, right?
correct.
So I don't know if you took class into consideration in that before you
Sure.
do,
Yeah.
or because for example, I studied in Denver, and it was fascinating. I'm from Guatemala. And when I just arrived, so I tried to meet people from Guatemala, and then I found out very quickly that if I met with certain people, I wasn't welcome to meet with other people like Guatemalans. Because it's very different when you come as a business, person have like $250,000 to open a business, and then you go to business and you have a certain type of life. Then if you cross the desert and expose your life, and you got documents.
Sure, that's a wonderful point, and Mary and I have been in Guatemala several times. So, and the problem that you have in developing countries is that you have a very large, poor section of the population, and you have a very small, wealthy group. If you're familiar with El Salvador, where the families were known as the 15 families that ruled the country, and then you have none middle class, very little class, and so. You're right. We have the folks that are coming to Iowa are not the ones from those 15 families. They don't need to come here. They're doing very well. Their countries are fortunately we don't have the middle class. But the population that's coming, doesn't have the experience or the leadership to yeah, because back home they did not have a venue to grow. And so what we try to do with our leadership is anybody can make it here. You have to connect with other people, you have to network, you have to get to know people. So that socializing and that trust factor is something that would be on their advantage. They do know that and they have the experience. But the idea is that you can grow from this class, as you were mentioning maybe, to another sector if you wish to, if you can, but you have to invest in it. You have to maybe finish your GED or whatever it is. Or you may have to work a little bit longer in the line, but then eventually if there's an opportunity for a supervisor, you can apply for it. So yes, that democratizing idea that people can grow in our country, it's something that we try to teach the newcomers, because in their countries are told, no, you're poor and you're always going to be poor. Unfortunately, that's why those countries can't seem to get out of those levels of poverty.
I know what I found, I've done a little bit of research with immigration from Guatemala and Mexico and Salvador, but what I found down in the south is that people want to migrate here with the idea to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So they wouldn't be necessarily interested in, I want to get a GED or I want to go get a bachelor's degree, because I just want to make enough money so I can go back to my country, back to my family.
And that's true. Very good point. With first generations, what happens? This is the immigrant dream, and it happened a lot with the Italians when they first came to this country. Is they went to come, America was paid for gold, we'll make a lot of money, and we'll go back and retire or work very nicely or open a business. What happens though, what we see, that's true with the first immigrant, and I experienced that myself. I was only going to be here for a few years, and I was going to go back. So what happens is, number one, is that you never make a lot of money enough to probably go back. America is not paying for alcohol, so you have to work and you have expenses and you have everything. The second thing that comes to play is children. Once the children are born here, I don't know, but my daughter probably doesn't want to move tomorrow to Spain. And, you know, she's born here, her friends are here, so I think there's eventually, the first generation is put in a very tough spot because their dream is to go back and show their family that they made it, maybe even help their family out of poverty, invest and open a business, whatever. And then the reality comes in, you know, we make our life here now, our children here. Unfortunately, we always hope for our countries to get better and violent, and that doesn't happen fast enough. So I've seen a lot of the first immigrants they have their home here, they're renting, they're building a house in Mexico, and eventually, and it makes me sad, but eventually they sell the house in Mexico or to another relative because they just not making that dream, unfortunately, transition fast. So hopefully that helps.
Well, and haven't we made that more difficult going back and forth with our new border restrictions? So we kind of created a problem. For years there was that open flow.
Sure, and that's why you see, you know, very low citizenship in the first generation is because, you know, they're very attached to their homeland. It's like, oh, well, if I'm from Spain, I don't want to be American, I want to be Spanish. And then the reality eventually hits, is like, okay, well, this is where I live now, this is for my family, they're not going to want to go back, you know, maybe to visit, but definitely not to leave. And so it's very hard to compete with the United States because we have such, again, the idea that you can grow and that you can improve your situation through education and working hard, versus in most of the countries, you have to know somebody, or if you belong to a class, you never have an expectation of moving to a second class or moving up the ladder. Does that make sense? Yeah. There was a study done a few years ago about the Italians, and when they did not want to become U.S. citizens because their dream was to go back to Italy and show their family they had made it and that they were wealthy, and so very low citizenship ratio with that first generation, and obviously eventually they had to, or their kids became citizens, you know, being born here and so on. But a lot of those Italians that first came died without gaining their citizenship, and because they always had that hope, I'll go back, you know. Yes.
What are some of the programs that are being put into place to help the communities already in place, like in Ottumwa? You know, there's a lot of work to be done to help the immigrants, you know, learn the culture, but there's got to be something on the other side too, because something's working really well in Ottumwa.
Sure.
So, what have you done there to help the people who have been there for generations?
What we've done from Extension is to thinking that we shouldn't go into your community and fix anything for you. What we're thinking is, if you have an issue, we'll go in, we'll give you tools, we'll give you best practices of what other states have been doing or what other communities, and then we'll give you tools like we have leadership seminars and so on, but you have to be invested in it. And that, I think that's something in Ottumwa that it was an economic first. There was obviously that reaction to it. It's like, we don't want people here. They're speaking our language. They're talking about us. Right? I always hear that. Like, I'm sure they have other things to talk about but you. Anyway, you know, and eventually, you know, the kids are now in the school district. And I like to argue that the kids are the solution, because the kids don't know the boundaries. And so when my daughter wants to go play outside, and the family next to me is from Cameroon, she doesn't see the color, she doesn't see the cultural difference. And so now I'm friends with the neighbors who I never used to talk to just because, you know, our lives are so busy because of the kids that connected. So we've been invited to celebrations and we invite to our house, but it's all because of the kids. So, you know, I think that's really the big connector in our communities is the kids, and then the rest of society moves on. But anyway, when we give communities tools and say, there is an answer to your desperation of divide.
You've spoken a lot about your successes with the immigrant population. I know that Ottumwa and some other communities that have meatpacking plants who are trying to get refugees in as employees, since refugees are legal by definition. So have you had to skew your outreach to that population and also the education because they have special needs due to being
And I would like to say yes and no. I think that all immigrants have some things in common that you can work on, and then obviously because of the background, they have different things. One of the things I noticed with the refugees is obviously that they have a big, they're gonna have some need for mental health or some type of support, because I mean, living for 12 years in a middle of the field in a refugee camp, you know you're gonna have some issues with that. It's just, a given. So I don't know if our communities are ready for that. The other thing is, the difference with Latinos is they were bringing their spouses and kids, many times undocumented, and so it was, the family had to deal with that then and there. We've had a very interesting thing happening right now, where a lot of the wives that came started to work at the meat plants or other, and they were undocumented, they were using fake papers. At that time, it was very easily, you just had to pay big money, but it would, the employers were not, they didn't have a system to weed, the undocumented out. So then now we have those women becoming citizens or residents. And what we have is that they're now being fired from their places of work because of lying to that company. So we have many, it's very common in Ottumwa, very, very large families that first came about 10 years, 20 years ago, that happened, and now the wife got her green card, went to the employer and said, hey, I have a green card now, and said, well, you're fired, you can no longer work here. That would be okay maybe in the community of Des Moines because you have other choices, but most of the rural communities have one big dominant employer, you have a monopoly of the workforce. And so what we're seeing in Ottumwa now is those families have to leave and move to another community and start from zero, which is obviously community-wise is a loss because the kids are in school and they bought a house and they maybe open a business. So that's a big trend that I'm seeing. With the refugees coming from Africa, we don't have that illegal component because you cannot just cross the border, you have to fly in the country, and so they are applying through their wives and kids, but that's going to take long. And so I see that family reunification is going to take longer, but I guess the good side of it is going to happen legally or in a better way, maybe for the family in the long term. Short term, they want to be with their family, and if they could, they would bring them now. So we have the men, which are by themselves, and so I have seen some cases of, they're depressed, or they're lonely, or they might get in trouble, and so on, because they don't have their whole family here,
So once the kids, I'm talking about the kids, once they get educated and, get more in the professional arena, are they going to stay in Iowa?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And we did some research because we wanted to know, are they going to leave and then we'll have to start from zero? And what we found out is that Latino, because of the culture itself, are less likely to spread around. They took the risk of moving, to a state, and then they ended up in Iowa. And so I would think it would be natural for them to jump to another state. And what we're seeing with those kids that are graduating and they're going to colleges, they like to go to college, but not very far. So we see high enrollment of Latinos from rural communities in Iowa State, in the University of Iowa, in community colleges, and then they try to find jobs in those communities or nearby. I know some families who have kids that graduated from college and the kids are now in Des Moines, their family's Ottumwa. That's okay, they feel comfortable with that. But I haven't seen any case, I'm sure there are some, but I haven't seen any cases where the kids, they don't want to be in Iowa, they move to Chicago, which was the trend that we were facing with the other population, the resident population, and they don't want to come back to Iowa. I'm not seeing that so far. We did some research in other states, and we found that was, the retention rate was higher with the Latino community than the non-Latino community, with their kids coming back or living in another community close to you. I mean, the job factor is obviously going to be there. If I graduate from the University of Iowa in a pharmacist, I cannot find a job at Ottumwa, I'm obviously going to look somewhere else. But it won't be too far from the nucleus of the family.
One of the other interesting things that happens culturally, I think, until we're 20 years out on this now, is that people in the Latino community that are the children of those first immigrants marry someone that's local, then that makes an attitudinal change within the established community. These are my people now, kind of thing. And I think we're at the point where we're not everybody, but I have large numbers of friends that have a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law that's Hispanic. When I went to college, I didn't know anybody who was Hispanic.
Sure. And when I meant kids, I probably should include maybe the people that are now, starting relationships. And you're right, even with the second generation, there's a large percentage that will marry within the same culture, but that again becomes less and less true. So I would say about maybe 50%, is the number I'm concerned for what I've seen, would still like to marry between the culture.
Oh,
but
there is a significant number.
Yes, significant number that are not. And obviously with the third generation, my daughter, she probably has no, concept of what, that first generation does. So I don't know what she's going to do. I don't know when to stop her, right? So even if I try, right? So you're right, it gets more interesting and more diversified and, somewhat diluted, whether good or bad, in the culture as well as we move down the generations, which is what we see historically as well. Julia, question?
Well, I was going to ask you that big political question. As you analyze attitudes in Iowa toward the Latino population, toward immigration, 10 years ago, today, and what you would project 10 years into the future, what are some of the changes and some of the observations you would make?
Well, I'm no guru, so I don't know what I can predict. What I see, what we can see, is there's a change in attitude towards diversity. So again, that talk that I said about, we can no longer assume that a Latino version is going to be born outside the country. It's something that I see change from 20 years ago, 10 years ago to now, where we're seeing the kids being born here. Sometimes, like my daughter, blonde and blue eyes, you cannot tell anymore that person, just by looking at that person. And so, very interesting, right? But the question is in the future, and I think the answer went back to the last election without getting too political. I think there was a notice to the American politics and government that diversity and immigration is still a big topic, and people are getting, that's still a big part that needs to be addressed. And looking at my own history with immigration, it's an issue. I was here as a student, I was here undocumented. Luckily, I was able to go back to the country where I'm from, and they didn't have a civil war, or Spain doesn't have extreme poverty, and so I was able to go back and fix the paperwork, and my wife and I came back. Now, we didn't have any children at the time. We didn't have a house to pay for, so we were able to just go but the reality is different. Most of the people, once you have children, once you buy a house, you cannot just say, I'm just going to pick up and go. The other thing is, if you come from a country where there's extreme poverty, or there's political issues, or violence, you cannot just go. I'm not going to put my family at risk. So there is no transition from undocumented to documented in this right now. And so when we're talking about 12 million people being undocumented, we have to address it somehow. And I don't care which part of the politics you stay, we have to address it somehow. And I don't know what the answer is, and I think every day that we wait is a day longer that we have 12 million people undocumented in our country. So we have issues in the state that I think we can address. One of the things that I think we could address very easily is changing some of the housing and the DOT rules that we have. For example, with trailer and mobile homes. In this state, we categorize mobile homes as vehicles, even though I haven't seen one driving around in 20 years. What happens with those mobile homes and trailer homes is that they're usually in places that is least desirable. Ottumwa, by the river, places that flood all the time. They're also more accessible. And so when you have a new group of people that are moving to a community with limited resources, large families, they look at buying the cheapest thing or renting. So we ended up with large concentrations of immigrants in those communities. So what happens is, you have a trailer, you sell to me, I'll buy it. Since I don't have a driver license because I might be undocumented, I'll just write you a contract and it's between us. And so later on, I sell it to somebody else, and I'll just write a contract. It's a mess, a big mess. And then you get the DOT involved, where last week we had somebody arrested because, according to the DOT, this person owned a vehicle without a driver license, which again, it's a trailer home. So we have a big mess, I think, going with that. And I think that's something that could be changed. I know it can be changed statewide. And so that's one thing that it will help clear that mess and facilitate home ownership. You can start a business in Iowa if you're undocumented. You can buy a home if you're undocumented, but you cannot drive or you cannot own a mobile home, which again is what you're buying. So that first generation or the first group. So again, that's my little answer for that very big question. So.